Thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to be here. Stefano is not, unfortunately, but he sends us greetings from Iraqi Kurdistan, and I hope he is following the presentation online. And hope after this presentation he will not exclude me from his friends list, because we were trying to combine different ideas, different observations, different ideas, for instance, Italian idea of 15 minutes and Moldavian one, so it's quite different phenomena, I would say. And the main thing we try to combine the data, our observations. So our data sets coming from two large collections of Yamnaya graves, sampling of 5,700 of burials coming from 1,900 of kurgans, compiled by Stefano for the entire Yamnaya area. And Yamnaya graves, a complete collection of Yamnaya graves from the territory between Dniester, Prut, and Danube rivers, counting 2,700 burials coming from 400 and something kurgans, compiled by me. The first, the lecture, it's a sort of challenge, and it consists of two parts. First one was made by Stefano, but will be presented by me. The first assemblage comes from, the first assemblage was analyzed in Stefano's PhD thesis, soon to be published, we all hope. And about from his doctoral dissertation to investigate the difference in the Yamnaya burial customs, composition of grave goods, demographic structure, and the absolute chronology. So, yes. And the next step from this to use this observed difference in multivariate statistical approach to model regional groups and chronological phases and provide a better frame for the study of the Yamnaya horizon. Some of the analysis yielded results whose interpretation is not exclusively restricted to the funerary sphere, but could instead to the be the reflection of other aspects of the Yamnaya cultural horizon, such as economic system and social organization. The first of these instances presented itself quite soon, while some heterogeneity in the distribution of graves and kurgans over the Yamnaya territory was investigated. This map shows the median number of Yamnaya graves per kurgan in the 16 studied regions. The central area with epicenter in the southern Buk region has the highest median number of burials per mound, with 6 Yamnaya graves per kurgan. The number of graves per mound decreases the further away we move from this area. And it even reaches 1 Yamnaya burial per mound in the farthest regions. So it's possible to observe a center-periphery pattern with higher values in the central and western regions of Yamnaya territory and lower values in the western and especially eastern periphery. So translating this information into archaeological terms, we observed that in the periphery, such as Tisa, Volga, Ural, Lower Volga, and Don, it is more common for a kurgan to be erected above a single Yamnaya grave and never used again during the Yamnaya period. Subsequent inhumations would require the construction of new kurgan, which in most cases would also house a single grave. On the other hand, in central and slightly western regions such as southern Buk, Dniester, Lower Dnieper, and Crimea, it is much more common for kurgans to be used for several subsequent inhumations during the Yamnaya period. More graves per mound might equate with the larger population living and being subsequently buried in this area. Since it's commonly believed that the individuals buried in kurgans were given special funerary treatment and represented just an undefined fraction of the entire population that was instead disposed of differently, it seems unlikely to provide reliable population estimates based solely on the materials coming from these kurgans. Possibly the best fitting model for this phenomenon used by Stefano was proposed by Professor David Anthony in his book The Horse, the Wheel and Language, where he postulates two mobility and economic systems observed east and west of the Don. The area around the lower Dnieper is described as characterized by a lower mobility of the Yamnaya groups, practicing a mixed agricultural stock breeding economy with a life centered around permanent settlements. It's assumed that the herders did not venture deep into the steppe, and this is evidenced by kurgan cemeteries being located just between 1 and 3 kilometers from the main river basins. In a scenario with a limited range of mobility gravitating around settlements, it seems reasonable for the communities to use the same cemeteries for extended periods of time, since they were always within reach. So conversely, the steppes east of the Don are characterized by higher mobility of the Yamnaya groups, relying entirely on a pastoral economy and possibly constantly moving even during winter. The herd's range of movement in this area is probably wider, and kurgan cemeteries are often located deep into the open steppe. And in this scenario, after the initial erection of a burial mound, the community might not return to the same pastures for several months, if not years, and subsequent funerals would have to be held in different locations with the construction of new kurgans. A central aspect of the common narrative on the Yamnaya cultural horizon is strongly male-centered society, evidenced by the predominance of adult male individuals in the graves. The skeletal assemblages collected over the decades are strongly affected by a research gap, the low number of examinations conducted by physical anthropologists on the materials. According to Stefano's statistics, we have only 17% or 1,000 and something of the 6,000 of individuals included in his database have their age at death described by an age interval, for example, 25, 30 years, while sex determinations are available only for 21% or 1,200 of the individuals included in the database. To be honest, for my own area, this figure is even less. So we are working with the very partial data, and throughout re-examination of the Yamnaya skeletal assemblages, if still stored in the collections, would be highly beneficial. So the sex ratio can be calculated for the individuals with the determined sex. The human sex ratio is calculated as the number of males divided by the number of female individuals in a population, and at birth is slightly based on favor of males with an average value of 1.05. In the Yamnaya horizon, the sex ratio based on the available data is strongly biased in favor of males, with the males to females ratio of 2.23, or a male proportion of 69, approximately 2 males buried in kurgans for each woman. Of course, this data is representative only of the individuals who were given burial in kurgans and not of the entire population, whose sex ratio at birth must have been close to 1.05. Higher male ratios are observed in the west of the Yamnaya territory, in particular in the middle Dnieper and Prut, where up to 80% of sex individuals are males. In comparison, the east presents generally lower ratios, with the Manich river, exhibiting the lower value of sort of 60% of sexed males. So the difference from the natural human sex ratio is statistically significant and seems to suggest a picture well based on Gimbutas' view on male-centered Yamnaya society. However, well-documented bias on the anthropological sex estimation of skeletal assemblages is responsible for the significant overrepresentation of adult males. This bias in favor of males was estimated between 10 and 15%, with an average of 12. So the high proportion of males over female in Yamnaya graves is therefore plausibly overestimated, and the reassessment of the sex attribution would probably reduce the difference in proportions to some extent, even though the sex ratio would still likely favor males. So, although the Yamnaya society can probably be described on the basis of the data presented above as male-centered, it is nonetheless worthy to highlight the presence of several female single inhumation primary graves. Primary graves are the first burials in a kurgan and the first over which the mound was erected. The activity requires a considerable effort and time, and the occupants of primary graves are thus often seen as individuals attaining a high status in the society. Women buried alone in primary graves probably held a high status themselves, and not because of their association with strong men, as it can be proposed for couple or collective inhumations. The frequency of occurrence of female single inhumation primary graves is always lower than the frequency of male primary graves, and generally follows the trend described on the previous slide. Anyway, within the entire Yamnaya horizon, at least 109 primary graves, or 6%, were built for women alone, probably holding a high status in the society, and this piece of information should also be taken into consideration when discussing the patriarchal nature of the Yamnaya communities. And the last topic Stefano would like to discuss and to touch upon is the direct and indirect evidence of interpersonal violence within the Yamnaya cultural horizon. Traumatic injuries were documented by anthropological examination on 51 individuals in the database, so it's less than 1% of the data set. The bar chart shows the frequency distribution sorted by region and ordered from west to east, and though frequency is too low to have statistical relevance, so it's 0.37 till 2%, it is possible to observe higher frequencies in the east than in the west, where traumas are mostly documented on the skull and the chest area and include few trepanations, appear to be post-traumatic surgery. Projectile wounds were recorded in 17 individuals, 14 times in the chest or back area, twice in the pelvis area, and once on the skull. In this chart line, you can see the relative frequency of the main grave goods categories found in Yamnaya graves sorted by region and ordered from west to east. The frequency of occurrence of weapons is highlighted in blue. It appears evident that weapons are found very rarely in Yamnaya graves, in less than 5% of them, in most regions, with only 2 peaks at 12 or 15% in the eastern regions of the Donetsk and Volga-Ural region. In the western periphery, that is the contact zone with local farmer societies of the Danube Basin and the Carpathians, the frequency of weapons is at its lowest, barely above 1%, and the general tendency shown from the chart indicates a slight but steady increase in frequency as we move from west to east. So the most common weapons found in Yamnaya graves are tiny metal daggers, followed by flint arrowheads and stone and metal axe heads, while other types of weapons are much less frequently documented. All metal daggers are generally counted as weapons in the literature, yet some scholars have posed the key questions of defining whether a dagger is a weapon or just a tool. Some use a very pragmatic approach in considering only daggers with the blade equal to or longer than 15 centimeters as weapons. Still, this solution must consider the extreme transformation of a blade undergoes after subsequent resharpening. A clear example is the dagger on the top left, which was resharpened so many times that the handle ended up longer than the blade. I'm trying to solve this issue, Stefano tries, of course, rather than solving it, but we must mention that the counting was made using the common approach of considering every metal dagger as a weapon or a former one. Thus, the values shown here are probably overestimated, and the real frequency of weapons in Yamnaya graves is most likely even lower. So the combination of the low evidence for traumatic injuries with the shallow frequency of occurrence of weaponry in Yamnaya inventories is in sharp contrast with the violent image of the Yamnaya culture presented in the distant or closer past. The archaeological evidence presented here speaks a scarcely militarized society, or at least a society not expressing a strong military ideology with few signs of interpersonal violence. The archaeological record only partially reflects the Yamnaya society, and new data could easily overturn this interpretation. Yet, the evidence currently available needs to provide a solid basis for the postulation of a violent community. Whew. And now let's go from this general picture to the local features I'm responsible for. My research area is northwestern Black Sea region, and is the westernmost periphery of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, part of the northwestern coast of the Black Sea, surrounded by the Carpathian Mountains, the Danube, and the Black Sea. Therefore, in different periods, this area was treated like a frontier or a sort of contact zone, which has led to it becoming a real archaeological El Dorado, taking into account the number of barrows. So, according to my calculation using various satellite images carried out for the National Agency of Archaeology of Moldova, there are almost 11,000 of burial mounds on the territory of the Dniester-Prut, between Dniester-Prut and Danube rivers, of which about 6,300 are in Moldova and 4,400 in the Ukrainian part. At least 1,300 of barrows containing at least 6,300 barrels were excavated between the Dniester and Prut rivers. So the degree of exploration combined with the distribution density of the kurgans gives an idea of the most promising regions for the future research, or in my case, the districts that could distort the general picture. Most likely, the construction of the burial mounds in the northwestern Black Sea region appeared at the latest in the second quarter of 4th millennium BC and continues until the 18th century AD. And it is easy to see that the construction of burial mounds covers two main chronological sequences. Most of the burial mounds were erected in the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age, and another peak of the barrow construction activity is connected with the early Iron Age and Roman period. It should be noted that the burial mound activity in these periods is significantly lower compared to the early Bronze Age, and among the barrows only 63% were introduced for the Moldavian part and only 54% from the Odessa region of Ukraine. So 134 tumuli, or 10%, belong to the late Neolithic. and early Bronze Age before the appearance of Yamnaya communities or pre-Yamnaya barrows, and 460 or 35% belong to the Yamnaya culture. Anyway, the main feature of Yamnaya culture is in this region is the largest number of burial mounds, secondary burials, and rearrangements. So Yamnaya communities are champions in all these activities. For example, there are 3 times more burial mounds than compared with the previous period, 9 times more mound rearrangements, and almost 11 times more burials in the Yamnaya period compared to the previous pre-Yamnaya phase. This feature is complemented by the wide territorial distribution, which includes the steppe and forest steppe region. In the northwestern Black Sea region, the highest concentration of Yamnaya barrows is located between the Dniester and Prut rivers, mainly in the south, in the steppe part. The number of barrows in the neighboring areas on the right bank of the Prut and Danube rivers and on the left bank of the Dniester is almost 7 times less. Anyway, on the left bank of the Dniester, the concentration of secondary burials is greater. Of course, Yamnaya burial mounds are also found in the west, on the territory of Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Serbia. However, between the Dniester and the Prut, there are almost 1.5 times as many Yamnaya barrows as in the areas to the west of Prut, and there are twice as many burials. The average number of the Yamnaya burials in the barrows of this region generally coincides with Stefano's observations. So there is an average of 4.4 burials per mound, but this figure varies from one local group to another, within 3.3 in the northwest in the Middle Prut and 5.7 in the Pontic area. So, in a certain way, both the construction of the burials and their size are based on a pragmatic view. For example, ledges are associated with secondary burials without exception, probably to cover them more easily with wood or stone. Pragmatism reveals a distribution of double and collective burials associated on average with large series of both the chamber and the ledge. Yes, but it's not just that. For instance, unfortunately, we have data on anthropology only within 290 cases, so it's about 10%, so it's lower than, according to Stefano observation for the whole Yamnaya area. And not all of them were carried out by professional physical anthropologists. However, of these, 160 are male, 113 are female, so the proportion is 55 to 45%. As for the primary burials, there are 25 male burials, while the female ones are 19, so it's the same proportion. There is no need to talk about a sharp predominance of the male primary graves, although this may be a sampling issue, of course. The rearrangements are associated with another 13 male burials and only 4 female. So there is a much greater disproportion between the central burials of adults, which are 86%, and children with adolescents. So the dimensions of the chambers for women and men are generally similar, with much more significant difference between children and adults. Despite the abundance of burial mounds and graves, unfortunately, Yamnaya is characterized by very modest grave goods. In less than 1/3, or 826 graves from 1,868, or 30%, are presented the grave goods. And now I would like to look at 3 different patterns in order of their prevalence. So the first, the most democratic one, consists of the pottery, known in 347 cases, or 13% of all sampling. And we are dealing with almost 400 intact vessels and 90 cases of presence of fragments of pottery in the graves. And let's talk about any radical difference between the Dniester-Prut region from both of west and east. And it's the main difference of the region I'm dealing with is the diversity of the types and forms and of pottery and various imports. Barrels with pottery were arranged in pits of various sizes, with a very high percentage of barrels of children and adolescents, so it's about a quarter of all sample, and this figure is much higher than the adult graves with pottery, so adult graves are about 11%. Another pattern is ornaments, a less democratic one, and is connected with the ornaments found in 166 burials, or 6% of all cases, or 20% of cases of graves with grave goods. And among them are various pendants made of animal teeth and metal. But the most common type, of course, it's spiral temple ring or spiral hair ring. So we have 78 cases. And most of them are made of silver. Only 17 are made of bronze or copper, and 4 were made of gold. Some of the types of vessels and ornaments also show the geographical differences. So, for example, so-called bujak situla and composite bracelets made of copper, as opposed to Yamnaya amphora and spiral rings, which are everywhere, are found only in the southern or steppe part of the region. So, weapons, without exception, are an element of the adult subculture. This is also noticeable in the size of the burial pits, but there is one big issue with that kind of grave goods. It is a real bizarre element of the funeral rite. For instance, flint arrowheads, with some rare exceptions, are found in a single quantity in a grave. And as a rule are found near human bones, among human bones, or inside human bones, and often are damaged. So, and the assumption is that these flint arrowheads are not part of grave goods or offerings. They could serve as a cause of death. Daggers, which make up more than half of all weapons in Yamnaya culture, judging by Stefano dataset, are extremely rare in my region. I would say that there is another significant difference between the Yamnaya culture of the region and that of both of West and the East. So if pottery is a feature of our region, so the weaponry is a sort of bug. The configuration of these patterns should be somehow explained, and I think this presentation is a sort of beginning of beautiful friendship, if I may cite the Casablanca movie. So, and I believe that combining a large-scale picture of the Yamnaya development or Yamnaya distribution with the regional detailing is crucial for us. And suppose we wish to understand the influence of the Yamnaya communities or Yamnaya impact, if I could use your trademark, on European prehistory. In that case, we need to know how the cultural landscape of the northwestern Pontic region or its steppe springboard was shaped. Thank you very much. Sorry for running out of time. Köszönöm nagyon.